today's Fireside chat, I'll be sharing the results of a very significant auction in the wholesale electric market, all coming to you now.
It's time to tune in for news and information, answers to questions, and more. Ladies and gentlemen, stand by for Gage Huston.
Nice dissolve.
In today's chat, I wanted to walk you through the results of MISO's recent capacity auction. The auction results were dramatic, and they could certainly have some implications on our power supply plans going forward. And so I felt it was really important to communicate this information with you. So as a quick reminder, there are two real kind of key aspects in the wholesale market. This concept of capacity and energy. So Doug came up with this great idea to correlate these concepts to a parking lot. So the picture on the left here kind of represents the amount of capacity you need. So if you're building a parking lot for the high school, you've got to build that parking lot to handle the peak amount of cars that you intend to have. It's Friday night lights, the football team's about to qualify for the state championship. You need enough parking spaces to cover that peak demand, plus a few extra. Energy is reflected more in this picture here. That's the amount of cars that are actually going into and out of the parking lot at any given time. So you need to build the capacity in the parking lot to cover that peak, and then the amount of actual cars that are coming in and out reflect the energy component. So just a quick recap, MISO does administer a capacity auction every year, what they refer to as a planning resource auction. And in that process, every load-serving utility, like us, we have customers, we serve load, we have to indicate enough capacity to MISO to cover our peak forecast plus some reserve margin. That can be done several ways. An entity could submit to MISO a fixed resource adequacy plan, or FRAP, that says, hey, I've got this load forecast, I've got this many resources on the books to cover it, so I'm good to go. Now MISO vets that plan, but then once they sign off on it, they say, okay, you're good. You could also do bilateral agreements with other utilities for capacity. We've done some of those in the past for our excess capacity. You could self-schedule, which means you participate in the auction, but you offer a certain amount of capacity at $0, so it's guaranteed to clear. We actually do that with enough of our capacity to meet our native local system demand, just to make sure that that much clears. And you can submit economic offers into the auction. So in our case, our excess capacity that we've had for a long time, we submit that as an economic offer with a particular price, and then only if it clears the auction at that price or higher, then you would utilize that capacity for MISO. And that can be done through any combination of those different things as part of this process. MISO takes all that information and they determine an auction clearing price based on a combination of the load forecast that comes in and the resources that are available. There are a lot of very complex factors that go into that, but at its most fundamental level, it's really just a supply and demand curve, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So what happened this year? The auction cleared dramatically higher than it has in the past. So this is the area MISO referred to as the North and Central region. This is the MISO South region. And you can see the prices in the North Central region cleared at $236 per megawatt day. That compares to $5 per megawatt day last auction. So it's about an increase of about 37 times. Oddly, MISO South cleared at just $2.88. So almost 100 times difference in clearing price between these two regions of the same market. And I'll explain a little bit as to why that happened. Just to highlight the volatility of capacity auction prices in MISO, you can see this is a history of all capacity auctions that MISO's done. They've only been doing this process since 2013, but you can see just how volatile that pricing has been. We actually had a spike up in 2016 and went to $72 a megawatt day at that time. We thought maybe prices are starting to rationalize. Even this is kind of a low price for capacity in reality. We felt that maybe things were starting to trend up, and then the next year it dropped right back down to almost zero. And it stayed fairly low the last several years until you can see the significant spike in this year's results. So what happened? So I mentioned this supply and demand equation. This is a graph of just the north central zones in MISO. And you can see this upward sloping supply curve. So this is all the generators in the system put in their offer into the market, and MISO basically stacks all those up into a supply curve like this. Normally you'd see a downward sloping demand curve like this, and where those curves intersect, that would be the market price for a commodity. MISO actually uses a vertical demand curve. So they take all the peak load forecasts, they add a reserve percentage, and they just draw that line vertically on the curve. There are a lot of issues with that process anyway, but in this case what happened was you can see the curves never intersected. The demand curve ended up all the way over here. So even with some imports of capacity from the south and from external parties, there was still a shortfall in the north central region of about 1,200 megawatts. And so what happened is the auction cleared essentially at the maximum price it can clear, which was at $236 a megawatt day. So this graphically represents kind of what was happening in the north central region. This blue bar here represents all the offers that were made in that region. The next bar up shows imports that came from outside parties. The next bar up shows imports that came up from the south region. 1,900 megawatts actually were imported from the south in the auction. But you can see the orange bar there, it still had a shortfall of 1,230 megawatts. So even with those imports, and they have limitations on how many imports can be brought in, there was a shortfall. And that's why the auction cleared at its maximum point for that part of MISO. MISO publishes this data as well, which I think is really important. What types of resources were cleared in the auction to cover capacity for the coming year? And so we've all seen the increase in wind and solar resources in the footprint, and on a year-over-year percentage basis, they're growing significantly. But when you look at the total makeup of the footprint, you can see that wind and solar still only represent about 5% of the capacity needs for MISO. And resources that are more traditional, coal, gas, and nuclear, still make up almost 80% of the capacity needs. So comparing to last year, so this is a curve of the entire MISO footprint, so a little bit different than the first curve I showed you. But I want to focus on the blue lines here. This is last year's supply and demand curve. So here again are all those offers for the generation units that were submitted. Here was that vertical demand curve. And you see in this case where they intersected was way down here. And so the auction cleared it at $5 a megawatt day for the north central region last year. This is another representation of that. You can see these areas up here cleared at $5. Even in last year's auction, there was some price separation between north and south. And the south region essentially cleared at zero. It cleared at a penny. So even last year, there was a big separation. It just became more dramatic this year. So what's happening? What is driving this trend in pricing across MISO? Well, one of the factors that's driving that is the change in resource mix. We're seeing more traditional units retire, like coal and gas plants, and we're seeing more intermittent renewable resources come onto the grid. So what's happened over the last 5 years, MISO's actually seen an increase in the amount of nameplate capacity in the system. So that's the blue line up there. Actually, we're seeing more nameplate megawatts on the system, but because they're different types of resources, the accredited capacity, or the reliable amount of capacity for resources, is actually going down. So if you replace, say, a 100 megawatt coal unit with a 100 megawatt solar unit, that solar unit has a much different level of accredited capacity. And so we're seeing that pattern across MISO, which is contributing to this issue. So what does this mean? So the auction price itself is one thing, but what does that mean for system reliability? And it's certainly an indication of something that could be cause for concern. MISO says that if these things continue, the shortfalls that are highlighted this year will continue. But they did hedge a little bit. MISO thinks that this year the system will remain stable. They have a lot of tools at their disposal when you get into the actual peak of the summer that they can move resources and load around. So they are still fairly confident they won't have any issues this year, but it certainly increases the risk that there could be things like rolling blackouts in the system when you have this kind of shortfall event. So it's certainly something to keep a very, very close eye on. So most importantly, what does this mean to MPW? Well, what does it mean to future auctions? Well, it's really hard to say. As I mentioned, the vertical demand curve process makes for some very volatile pricing, and we've certainly seen that across MISO. As I mentioned, it spiked up to $72 a few years ago and then right back down. That could happen this year. Cleared way up at $236, could drop right back down next year. And just to highlight how close the difference is between low pricing and high pricing. If the load forecast in the north central region was just 1.3% lower than it was in the auction, the imports from the south would have been enough to cover that north central region shortfall, and it would have cleared at a much lower price, probably somewhere closer to $2.88 versus a $236. So even 1.3% change in load forecast could have had a significant impact on auction price results. We do know that transition to renewables will continue, so those accreditation levels will continue to drop off overall as that happens. And then also MISO is looking at implementing a seasonal resource adequacy construct. Right now, they essentially just look at a summer peak forecast and they run all the auction on that, assuming that's kind of your worst case scenario. But they recognize there are other issues throughout the year, and different seasons have their own challenges, and so they're going to be moving to a seasonal construct. At this time, it's really unclear whether that will actually increase or decrease the pricing overall in the auction. What does this mean to MPW? So financial impact in the short term, certainly very, very positive. So we're looking at June 2022 through May 23. That's the planning year that MISO clears the auction. So we'll see capacity revenue and capacity purchases will go up significantly above what we had budgeted because the price is so much higher. Because we have excess capacity, we'll see the net revenue from the auction be very, very positive. So the blue bar represents kind of the amount of capacity revenue we need to cover our native system, and then the orange bar represents that excess net revenue from the auction. This is what we forecasted for that period of time. This is what we're actually going to see based on the auction results. And the net revenue to us will be about $6.7 million. So very, very positive result for us in the short term. Now that will be offset to a certain degree due to some higher O&M to keep the units available during that time, but overall should be very positive. What does that mean to the plant operation? In the short term, Units 7 and 8 in 8A will continue to operate and be available. 7 and 8 will need to be available at least through May of 2023 because it cleared through that whole planning year. During that time, they'll be subject to market pricing. We'll continue with any stack testing or other requirements that we have. Unit 8A, as of now, the steam sales contract is set to term out at the end of this calendar year, so the end of December 2022. And we'll continue with all of our current projects. The other things that we had planned, we'll keep moving forward. Medium-term impact, a little more up in the air. It's something we've known for a long, long time is that installed capacity has value, both to the grid and to us here in Muscatine. Capacity revenues, if they stay elevated like they did in this auction, they can be used to help cover fixed O&M costs for keeping plants around and available. However, that auction price uncertainty still remains. We could see prices drop right back down next year. What about the planned retirements of Plant 1, or Units 7, 8, and 8A? That's something we're looking into now. We had planned a retirement in May of 2023. With these results, it certainly indicates the prices could stay elevated, which would be beneficial, and it indicates that there could be reliability concerns on the grid. So if you have excess capacity, is now the right time to retire? So those are the things we're evaluating. And what does it mean for MPW's net capacity position? So as we're going through Powering the Future efforts and planning out farther our power supply plans, what kind of net capacity position do we want to be in? Do we want to be a net buyer or a net seller of capacity? So the power supply study rerun that we're working on now, there's a lot of assumptions that get put into that in terms of pricing forecasts. So capacity auction prices are a key input into that study. So now these results possibly shift where we start that price point in what we put into the forecast. So we're going through those discussions now. So what that means is if you have a higher price, that additional capacity revenue could change the results of some of those portfolios that we're studying. It also highlights that the market price risk is even more dramatic even than what we modeled last time. When you can see these significant spikes up in price, you've got to be really aware that that price volatility and the impact that has on your customers. And it looks like we'll continue to see value placed on local generation assets where you have control over your capacity and you're not just subject to the market pricing. Very, very important. One thing to note though, when we go through these studies, is really looking at a high level on a long-term horizon. it doesn't really try to dig into more real-time reliability events, like for example, the Texas Arctic storm of February 2021. You might have had enough capacity on paper to manage the load, but how did that capacity actually perform during that event? The power supply studies we do don't get into those specific storm type event scenarios, so that's another thing that we as a management team have to plan for and keep in mind as we're plotting out our power supply future. So what does this all lead back to for now? It means that the value capacity could remain escalated in the years to come if the auction price stays elevated. We don't know that yet. But as we continue to see the expansion of intermittent renewables, we'll likely have two key impacts on the system. It will tend to drive down the market price of energy when the wind and sun are available, because they're kind of free fuel, if you will, and so the energy will be lower cost during those times. But it'll tend to drive up the market price of capacity because you still need other resources or other capacity resources available to cover that volatility when the sun and wind aren't available. And for us, it just means we need to stick to our fundamentals that we've talked about since we started our Powering the Future initiative, balancing out reliability, affordability, flexibility, and sustainability. And we think that these results really just bring us right back to that balance and how important it really is. So, very complex situation, and I know I threw a lot of information at you today, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Either Doug or myself would be happy to talk through the results of this auction. We've been sharing this information with employees throughout the utility. We're always happy to take questions. If you're wondering what the impact to our operation will be from this, don't hesitate to send us a note and we'll be happy to answer your question. So that's all for today. Thank you so much. Take care.